This unit is called the Baroque age, and the term Baroque in reality makes reference to the art of this period. The origins of the word vary, but might have like its etymology might make reference to words such as like pearl or too over decorated, or even rocal in French that means like rocks. So the Baroque art is based on the response to a change in society that occurred in the 17th century. So it's partly a response to the Renaissance art and its achievements and its obsession with reason and balance. And the Baroque tries to take those elements, but at the same time put them in another dimension, because it tries to break everything that is balanced, poses the feelings over reason, passion, is what in ancient Greece they call the pathos. Yeah, that we saw in the history, in art history, in the ancient Greece. We talk about the classical period that was very based on proportion, and then the Hellenistic period in which reason loses its power over the feelings, the emotions, the pathos. So that is something that happens in the Baroque. So the Baroque art takes elements of the previous period, so it takes elements of the classical culture in architecture, for example, takes all the achievements and learnings from the Renaissance in painting or in sculpture, but tries to make them more passionate. So we don't see anymore these like very temperate feelings or like these emulations of the classical past, but is everything about suffering, emotions, and also in the Catholic part of Europe, it's also related to like the response of the Catholic Church to the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. So we see a lot of religious art that is based on the lives of saints, their martyrdom, their tortures, the cult to the Virgin, and in general like the worship of the Virgin and the saints. That is going to be very important. Also, there's going to be an obsession with death, with suffering, with like the contrast of like life and death, and also with poverty, because the 17th century is going to be a century of great distress in Europe. Wars, famines, epidemics were going to be suffered by the population, and in general, like it was like a lot of poor people who suffered. So we are going to see that also in art, mainly in painting. So let's see more in detail. So the Baroque architecture takes the elements that the Renaissance architecture took from the classical time, but altered. So the Baroque is all about emotion and suffering and moving your soul. So that in architecture was translated to taking these classic elements into a new dimension with like changing shapes. Yeah, so just trying to get like something unexpected. So they still use columns and pediments and entablatures and capitals, but changing their size. Yes, so for example, they use the gigantic order that was so remember the order is Ionic, Doric, Corinthian. So the gigantic order was an order that took, instead of one level, like two levels. Yes, so it was huge, gigantic. This was very common in so we see it here. Yes, for example, these columns taking two levels. And also, for example, broken pediments. Yes, so this pediment was here and it is broken. Or also the Solomonic columns, columnas salomónicas, that are these twisted columns that in many cases also were decorated, over decorated. Also, if we see the floor plans, they were very complex. So instead of having a rectangular floor plan or a circular floor plan or like a Latin cross floor plan, they started to create these more complex floor plans that had mixed lines, just making like very different interior spaces. So here we can see one important church built by Bernini, that is, we can say, the most and first, like almost the inventor of Baroque architecture in Italy. So in this outside we can see this facade that takes these elements, classical elements, but breaking in, with this facade that comes out. But if we see the floor plan, we see, here how he created this space, like a concave space with this convex space with this concave staircase, and then this oval shape of the interior space. The other most important architect of Italy is Borromini. He took even farther these concepts of like very irregular facades. We can see this in San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane. So we see this curved entablature, this broken pediment with this big medallion, these openings, like walls, estos vanos y muros, so these spaces that go in and out. Here creating the space for saints, because remember that one of the principles of the Counter-Reformation was the cult to the Virgin and Saints. So that explains this kind of facade. So if we see another church by Borromini, this one that has this concave facade, inside we see that it has this crazy shape, like a star, but it's not even a star. This is like a star with these rounded corners, that creates a very particular shape. In the case, for example, of France, Baroque took a different style, more like the decoration was concentrated in some points, and more rectangular shapes on the buildings and the facades, and then some tendency to accumulation of decoration in some points. The most important building it's the Versailles, the royal palace. And here we can see the gardens, and then it was inside where all the decoration was accumulated. This is built a little bit more by the end of the 17th century, when Baroque just got even more obsessed with decoration, with gold. So that is why we associate Baroque with this concept of over decoration. We can see that it's different, like the Baroque used in palaces, in which Versailles was going to be a model, and in like when it was invented here in Italy in these churches. Again, it's an evolution of the sculpture in the Renaissance. So the same way that in the last period of ancient Greece, sculpture passed from being very static and rigid and calm, balanced, to show this pathos, these emotions. The same happened with sculpture. So also as a consequence of the Counter-Reformation, and these changes in some religious views that affected other areas of life, we can see that the sculpture in this period is very theatrical. So theater became very popular in Europe at this period, and we can see it completely in sculptures like this one of Bernini that we just mentioned in the architecture. So Bernini had two main topics. One was religious topics, mainly it is the period of the mysticism in religion, such as Saint Teresa of Jesus, Santa Teresa de Jesús, San Juan de la Cruz. Like these religious people that were wrote poetry about their experiences with God, and this was very well represented
by Bernini, with this concept of creating sculptures that were almost in a stage, no? Estaban como en un escenario of a theater. Again, with these elements, like the columns, the broken pediment, the entablature, but overly decorated, full of color, with marble of different colors. And again, we can see here, that he created these metal bars, with light that came from the outside, from a window, like an enlightenment, as like the light of God that was piercing Santa Teresa. There's another very famous ecstasy sculpture by Bernini, of another, in this case it was not a saint, it is blessed, una beata, called Ludovica Albertoni, also in this moment of ecstasy. And Bernini was a genius, but in general, the sculpture in this period just tries to be very realistic, even if sometimes has to be like far from beautiful. And we can see this in the Spanish architecture. Sculpture. They oriented a lot their sculpture to religion too. Remember how obsessed with religion were the Habsburgs, and the Counter-Reformation since Philip II. So we have a very particular type of sculpture that is mainly done in wood, carved wood, and then painted, which allowed it to be very realistic compared to marble, just to look really like people. And we have these scenes that we usually see in Easter, in Semana Santa, of like the scenes of the Passion of Christ, the Virgin Mary with her dead son here. And also these images for the worship of the Virgin, very typical of the Counter-Reformation. Or here like the Magdalene penitent. So this like they develop a lot this part. And then we have the other side, that it was more continue the tradition of the Greco-Roman mythology, and we have here this good example of Apollo and Daphne, where we can see these like another classical characteristic of the sculpture in this period, that is movement. Instead of having a static sculptures, we have these sculptures that are movement, that we can have to surround to see them completely and understand them completely, and then they play with light, and with the spaces that are created in between, creating very complex works of art. Is the painting, which is the more complex, but I will just try to keep it short. So again, we can say that the origin of Baroque in all styles is based in Italy, and it is here that in the early 17th century we see the invention of a new type of painting that was going to be called Tenebrism. We can say that it was invented by Caravaggio, probably the best painter of this period, and he created these religious paintings that followed these more like this approach to religious stories that was just trying to make it extremely realistic, as if Jesus Christ or the saints or his like disciples of Jesus Christ were regular people of the street of the 17th century. Yes, so he took natural models from the street, like regular people, and he represented them, in scenes and with furniture of the 17th century, which made it very close and very easy to understand for the people of that moment. That what they were seeing and the stories that they were hearing about Jesus or the saints were similar to and understandable by them. So here we see a scene in which Jesus Christ is discussing with some of his disciples. We see this word, this term of tenebrism, is because he created a system that contrasted a lot light and darkness, creating huge shadows and contrast, and the skin was treated in a way, as if it was in interiors, lit from a small window or with candles. So another Italian women painter was Artemisia Gentileschi, and she she was she learned from Caravaggio. She came from a family of painters, and she suffered quite a lot herself. And she ended up becoming quite an important painter. Here we see one of her most famous paintings, and in this case mythological, that is still remained one important and common topic. In this case is like, in this case is a religious of the Old Testament. It is Judith beheading, decapitando Holofernes. If we move to the Spanish Flanders, the most important painter of this period is Peter Rubens. He created a very particular style, that showed, it was a very prosperous region, that made a lot of money with trade, and somehow his painting shows, this easy life, also always like with mythological or religious topics, but also very theatrical. We can see these they are these are the three graces, but they are like in nature, in a landscape, but with a fountain, but also like some drapery here, flowers. So everything has a feeling of a theater, and always he liked to create this treatment of women's skin, like very morbid, very pale. That is very easy to recognize. You can visit this, see this painting in the Prado Museum. And then in the Netherlands, so in the part that gained independence from Spain, the most relevant painter is Rembrandt. He belonged to the part that was non-Catholic, that was Protestant, Calvinist. So we see a completely type of society. We don't see religious paintings because Protestants didn't want to represent religious images. So painting here was more based on like portraits of people, in many cases like people who commission portraits, or even groups of people that work in the same guild, en el mismo gremio, and wanted to have like a common group portrait, as we can see here in this very famous portrait that is called Anatomy Class of Dr. Tulp. And we see here, a series of doctors, of surgeons that are on a class with a real corpse, and they are just cut in this moment. Some of them are looking at the painter, others are looking at, the muscles and tendons. It's almost like a photograph. It's beautiful. Rembrandt was extremely talented. And then now we move to Spain. We can say that we have in Spain, it was a golden period in Spain for painting, for literature, it's the century of Quevedo and of Cervantes. And so there are many great painters. So an important one is José de Ribera, or Giuseppe de Ribera, because he worked most of the time in the south of Italy, and he developed a very his own style, that tried to be very, very realistic. He made many portraits or scenes of saints, but always represented as like people that were poor from the streets. Yes, so in this case, this is Saint Hieronymus, San Jeronimo, and he's represented like a very old and like physically affected person. And then obviously the greatest Spanish painter of this period is Diego Velázquez. He was born in Seville, but he was quite young. He was very talented. He moved to Spain, and he became the painter of the court of Philip the Fourth. He was a close friend of the Count Duke of Olivares, and that helped him just to enter in the court. Velázquez was incredibly talented, and he painted all kinds of things. So he has very important mythological paintings such as this one that represented god of wine, Bacchus. But also, so it is interesting, how Bacchus as a Roman god, is represented with drunkards of the 17th century that you can find in a tavern, and he is crowning one of the drunkards, so it's as if we are picking in, a tavern, a pub of the 17th century in Spain, and we are seeing this as seen. So he managed to combine mythology and reality in a very talented way. But he made all kinds of paintings, religious paintings, obviously, which was the most common in Spain at that time. But because he was the painter of the court, he also made many portraits to the royal family. The most famous of all, which is extremely relevant and transcendent for the history of art, is this portrait of Las Meninas, in which one of the infants, una infanta, one of the daughters of the king, is represented with her maids, con sus meninas, con sus ayudantes. And in this case, we can see the complex composition because, the portrait is at the center, but there are many things happening at the same time. The scenario is the studio of the painter, and he is himself being portrayed, painting the scene, and at the same time we can see also here the king and the queen, looking at the scene. So it's as if we entered secretly into the painter's studio and saw what was going on, which was very new for that moment, and the fact that he painted himself with the royal family was extremely avant-garde. It was like a drastic change. He knew how talented he was, and that is why he painted himself in this painting. So there are tens of paintings of Velázquez that we could talk about this for a long time, but I think I can recommend you to visit as soon as you can the Prado Museum that is in your city and enjoy many of his paintings.